I thought I'd make a short video, or try to make a short video, to cover the two authors that we have this week, Ernest Hemingway and William Faulkner, who are roughly contemporaries. Both men won the Nobel Prize for Literature, Faulkner in 1949 and Ernest Hemingway in 1954. And what you see here is the medal for the Nobel Prize. I always wondered what it looked like. There it is. We'll start with Ernest Hemingway. He's a Midwesterner born in Chicago. He started off life as a newspaper man. He never went to college. He was a high school graduate, and back when he would have finished high school, was during World War I. He was unable to enlist in the American Army because he had high blood pressure. And so he joined the International Red Cross and became an ambulance driver in Italy. He was very severely wounded in his first couple of months at the front, and that experience formed the basis for his second novel, A Farewell to Arms. He became famous first as a short story writer, and his first short story collection, In Our Time, was published to very interesting reviews. Many of the stories were, by the standards of their time, sexually explicit. They dealt with murder, they dealt with suicide, and they also dealt with other aspects of human existence. They're not all downers by any means, but it was oddly received. But people said this was a new voice in literature. He came to fame with a novel called The Sun Also Rises, which is a 1924 novel that takes us through Spain. If you've ever seen The Running of the Bulls at Pamplona, he made that famous. He was a bullfight aficionado. In fact, wrote a book about it called Death in the Afternoon that's still a classic. I am not a fan of Spanish bullfighting, but the book itself makes you understand kind of what is the attraction for those things. Farewell to Arms is based in part on his experiences in the First World War, as I said. He was kind of a man's man. If there was anything that men traditionally did, he was the guy who did it. He was a bullfighter. He was a deep sea fisher. He was on safari. A lot of that kind of gets overwhelmed. His writing itself, I think, is some of the most extraordinary in American literature. Many of us are drawn to his style, and it's an easy style to read, but you don't realize quite how much work goes into it to make it as simple and as straightforward and as powerful as it is. In our Blackboard session, our Blackboard folder for this week, you'll find a link to a Ken Burns documentary. He's the guy who made the Civil War and baseball and jazz for public television. And he makes the point that Hemingway was a meticulous craftsman, a constant reviser. And if you watch the video, you'll see that the ending, the last paragraph of Farewell to Arms, he revised 47 times. He was not always at the top of his game, I'll tell you that. And there's a lot of his fiction that is not quite of the standard of the one that we're reading, Hills Like White Elephants, which I'll talk about in a minute. Prolific, famous, sort of every stereotype you can think of about a male American white writer in the 20th century, Hemingway fulfills. But a complicated guy. He was married 4 times and had multiple affairs in his life as well. What you may find interesting, since most of us are St. Louisans of one kind or another. I, as I'm sure you know, am from San Diego, but I've been living here for 20 years. My wife is from Jefferson County, and we met overseas. And I always think that Hemingway and I have something in common. If you marry a St. Louis girl, they come back. This was his first wife. 3 of his wives were from St. Louis. Hadley, his first wife, he was married from 1921 to 26. This is their child. I think his real name was Jonathan James, and they called him Bumby. She was an MICDS grad before it was MICDS. MICDS used to be 2 schools, one for men, one for women, and she graduated from Mary Institute. They were married for a relatively short time. 5 years. They spent much of that in Paris and in Austria. That's where you see these two over here. He really was in love with her in an interesting kind of way. But like a lot of other men, he found himself attracted to other women, and he began, while he was married to Hadley Richardson, to have an affair with a woman who became his next wife, and she's also from him. And that's Pauline Pfeiffer. She's a visitation grad, practicing Catholic. In fact, Hemingway had to convert to Catholicism in order to marry her. She didn't spend her whole life in St. Louis. She grew up here, went to school here. Her family, her father was a wealthy real estate developer, moved to Piggott, Arkansas to develop real estate there. And she stayed here and went to Mizzou, got a degree in journalism, which is relatively unusual for a woman in her time. Very smart, very interesting woman. They had an affair for 2 years before he and Hadley divorced so that he could marry her. It was complicated because he had to get his first marriage, annulled by the Catholic Church, which is odd because he wasn't married. His first marriage wasn't celebrated in the Catholic Church. It was very complicated. They were married for a long time, 13 years. But of course, part of that period of time, he was having an affair with his third wife. Here is his third and last St. Louis wife. He's married one more time after this. She's also from St. Louis as a John Burroughs grad. You kind of sense that he married women who went to private schools. And she was an extraordinarily gifted journalist and short story writer and essayist in her own right. She was also, and these pictures do her a little bit of justice, but she was drop dead gorgeous. And Hemingway was just smitten, and he spent the last year or two of his marriage with, actually longer than that, it goes back to 1937. He began having an affair with Gellhorn during the Spanish Civil War, and spent basically 3 years with her in and out of Spain, covering the Spanish Civil War, and the two of them shared a hotel room at a suite actually at the Hotel Florida. There's a wonderful book called The Hotel Florida about that experience. They divorced in 1945, mainly because they were too similar. She was a very competitive journalist, so was he. Both of them were covering the war in Europe, 1944 and 1945. She was the only woman who landed on the beach at D-Day in 1944 and filed a story from it. Hemingway was furious because he was on a boat on the offshore and wasn't allowed to go in, but his wife somehow snuck in with a group of hospital troops and was able to spend time on the beach, take photographs, and file a story. But neither of them really were suited for each other. And unfortunately, the marriage didn't last very long. They had no children. He had 2 children with Pauline, 1 child with his first wife. Fourth time's a charm. He married Mary Welsh, who he met at the same time that he was in London covering World War II when he was married to Martha Gellhorn. Before she got there, he had an affair with her, with Mary, and that was one of the reasons that his third marriage broke up. Welsh stayed married to Hemingway until his suicide in 1961. He suffered from an extraordinary amount of injuries. The high blood pressure that he'd had during World War I was never treated properly, and that got out of control. But he also suffered a number of concussions, most of which were undiagnosed. And then he tried different drugs for pain and things like that. Like many celebrities, his medical care was a mess. And it finally killed him, basically, in the sense that he got to a point where he had become delusional, and had a very sad end to his life. Part of the suicide also relates to the fact that he had lived in Cuba basically from the 1930s until 1959, until the Castro Revolution, and he lost access to his house there, Villa Finca, and he never really recovered from that. You can visit the house in Cuba, but he died at a house that he and his family bought in the 1960s, early 1960s, in Ketchum, Idaho, where he had been hunting. A very sad end to a very complicated life. And Mary Welsh, as you can see, outlived him for quite a few years and actually oversaw the publication of a variety of his unpublished works. And those are of varying quality. This, by the way, is a picture of Mary as a war correspondent in World War II. War correspondents, if they worked for newspaper or magazines, were considered to be like commissioned officers in the military. And so that's why she's wearing a uniform. That was how they had status under the Geneva Convention. It's not something that we do anymore. Hills Like White Elephants is a very short story. It's told almost entirely through dialogue. It was published in 1927, so about 10 years before the Spanish Civil War. pardon me. And then it was published again in Men Without Women, and that came out the next year, which was a second collection of his short stories. It's set in Spain, where Hemingway spent a great deal of the 1920s and 30s, as I've mentioned. Spain, of course, is a Catholic country. In this period of time, the church was an extraordinarily powerful institution. And we have two Americans, who are traveling in Spain, and the girl is pregnant. And so the issue is what to do. They're not married to each other. The whole issue in the story is should she terminate this pregnancy? Should she have an abortion? And it's never explicitly stated, but that's what they're talking about. And there's a whole bunch of sort of things going on in the story, the dialogue, the setting, the way the characters are described, the actions of the characters, even down to what they're drinking at various times. All those kind of contribute to an extraordinarily compact but vital story that I simply cannot ever stop reading. I can't tell you how many times I've read this story. And it's one that I see something different every time. I've read it, in fact, to make this video 3 times today. And every time I read it, I see a little thing that I've never quite noticed before. And the issue in this, does she terminate the pregnancy or does she not? Do they stay together? Do they not? That's all unresolved. Most of the story, as I've said, is told through dialogue. And when you're reading it, look at who's saying what to whom, and you get a sense for what the tone is, how they respond to each other. And it tells us a whole lot about their relationship. Neither character is described. We don't know physically what they look like at all. I have no idea if I were casting this into a movie, who I would have playing whom. But that's something you might want to think about if you want to write a paper on this. I've done a little bit of research today to try to figure out where exactly this story takes place. The rail junction that they're at is not named. They're in the valley of the Ebro, which is in northeastern Spain. The Ebro is a long river that goes eventually to the Mediterranean, but it rises in the mountains of the Pyrenees. And they are sort of at a midpoint of where the river and the rail line between Madrid and Barcelona meet. And the story, Hills Like White Elephants, comes from this kind of terrain where you have sort of trees down here at the bottom. And this would be where they would be, at the level, sort of sea level where the railroad is, not up in the mountains. And so they wouldn't be looking at the mountains in quite this angle. You might get another sense of it like this. This is the Ebro itself. This is the Ebro Valley. And the river is actually running along the edge of these mountains. It's where these trees are. And the railroad tracks running alongside of it. You can get a little bit of a sense of it here. If you look at this is the railroad line. Now, where exactly the railroad line is from the story, I can't tell you. He never says that, and I spent way more time than I should on a map that I'm going to show you in a minute to try to figure it out. But this might give you an idea of why she says what she says. Hills like white elephants, and you may decide that these pictures might give you a notion of what she has in mind. And of course, they don't, as she says, they don't look like white elephants. It's just the color of their skin through the trees, which is an extraordinary. Where are we? Again, I had to do some digging for this. This line, this purple line here, goes from Barcelona to Madrid. And that's this map over here is Madrid. This is a 1931 Spanish railway map. Don't tell me, I don't want to tell you how much time I spent looking for this thing. These red lines and yellow, red lines are also railroad lines. But where this occurs is in this part of the rail line. They're at a junction that it brings the red line and the purple line, the express train line, together. And so they're kind of at the midpoint between Barcelona and Madrid. They're between two rail lines. They're in a little tiny station that has 2 sides. So you can see that this is one of those stories where the setting kind of balances itself, where you get this sense that these guys are poised exactly in the middle, like we are in the middle of a decision where we've figured here are the options, but we haven't made up our mind yet. Okay. And so the story begins and is set at that moment between deciding what choices you have and then making that choice. But the making of the choice occurs after the end of the story. And so the setting, I think, the rail station, the tracks, the river valley, the mountains, everything kind of conspires to put these people exactly in the middle, almost like there's a balance. And what we're watching is a couple in balance, almost like they're on a teeter-totter, and it's going up and down a little bit as they go from one side to another. But this red circle is something I put on here just to show you where we are. Okay. This, by the way, is the kind of train station that they would have been waiting in. This is a decommissioned Spanish train station that I found that was built in the early 1920s. The story's set in 1927. So this is sort of kind of what they would have been in. There would have been a ticket office and a bar on the first floor, and maybe offices for the train folks up here at the top. Now that we've spent a lot of time with Hills Like White Elephants, I'm going to switch to our other author for the week, William Faulkner. He's 2 years older than Hemingway. He dies 1 year after Hemingway. They have an interesting connection because there's a point in Faulkner's life where he writes a screenplay based on a Hemingway novel. And the screenplay ends up turning into a movie that is not much like Hemingway's novel at all. But it is the movie that introduces us to Lauren Bacall as an actress. And it's the movie where Humphrey Bogart falls in love with her. The actress, Lauren Bacall, 1947, To Have and Have Not. Faulkner is a Southerner, and I mean deep, deep, deep Southerner. And there's probably no more Southern writer in America than William Faulkner. And he's someone, as you can see, who's born after the Civil War. His father had been in the Civil War. His family had been prominent at one time in Mississippi, but it kind of sort of fallen on hard times. Oxford, Mississippi is where Faulkner spent much of his life. I'll show you a picture of his house eventually. That's also where the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, is. Okay. He couldn't join the American Army because he was only 5 feet 5 inches tall, but he wanted to fly. So he joined the Royal Flying Corps, the British Royal Flying Corps, through the Canadian Flying Corps, but he never got into combat. He went through pilot training, and the war ended before he was able to go overseas and fight. So he became a novelist, a short story writer, and became famous in those capacities. And then, like a lot of other writers, and we'll see this when we get to F. Scott Fitzgerald next week, that he becomes a screenwriter in Hollywood because that's where the money is. Okay. He also wrote poetry, but not very much. And as I mentioned earlier, wins the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1949. I would say that both Faulkner and Hemingway tend to create their own personas, and that's one of the reasons that I've kind of put them together. You can see we move from younger to older Faulkner here. This is his mother, and he's famous from a line from The Sound and the Fury, which is probably his most famous novel, which is one that's very much about the South and the after the Civil War South and what the effect of the defeat of the South was on Southerners of a variety of classes of people. The past is never dead. It's not even past. That is, we're so haunted by the past that it may as well be in the present. It's like it never leaves us. And those of you who might have older relatives who find themselves living in the past a lot or complaining about what's going on in contemporary times, I think that's a sentiment that might resonate with some of you. These are the major writing years of Faulkner. He wrote probably until 1960, well, 1960, I think was the last book, The Reivers. But he was considered a major American novelist all through the 20s and late 20s and early 30s and 40s. He was the guy you read if you wanted to say, yes, I'm a serious student of 20th century American fiction. These days, I think because we have so many other kinds of writers, we have people of color now who write about the South, and we have other minority groups, people who were always on the outside before are now on the, much more included in the canon. And so you tend to see people like Faulkner kind of being pushed, I don't want to say pushed aside, but he's de-emphasized as the single major Southern writer. We're going to meet a couple of other Southern writers towards the end of the semester, in particular a contemporary poet named Natasha Trethewey, who I like very much, who has the same kind of meditations in her poetry about what does it mean to be a Southerner and what does it mean to be the inheritor of a South that's lost the Civil War. I think for white people, that's one experience. I think for African Americans, who of course moved from slavery to freedom and then to the Jim Crow era in the South, as we've talked about before, have a very different notion of how all that works. Okay, Faulkner is famous for inventing a place, sort of a mythical county called Yoknapatawpha County in Mississippi. It's completely made up, but it's not too far from the Mississippi Delta. It's a place where everything in his novels happen. And the county seat of that county is called Jefferson. And that's where our story takes place. He has families from different social classes. The Griersons, the Sartorises are old-timey Southerners. These would have been the officers, the generals, the state leadership during the Confederacy. And they fall on hard times, of course, after the war because so much of their capital is tied up in slaves. And then all those disappear. And of course, their plantations are ruined and things. And these people then become displaced in an interesting kind of way. They have status, but they don't have any money. And that's kind of where Emily comes in. She's the second generation of that. She's not a Civil War child, but her father was a Civil War veteran, Colonel Grierson, just like there's a Colonel Sartoris. Then there's the Snopeses, the Bundrens. These are different classes of people. We don't see them in this story, but they're very common in the Yoknapatawpha County stories of Faulkner, which is, again, where most of his books take place. So made up place, but people who are based on the types of people who would have been living in the, late 19th, early 20th century in the South. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of what Jefferson must have been like, this is a picture of the main street in a Mississippi Delta town in 1930. And so the story is published in 1931, which we can just assume is kind of when Emily dies. But of course, she's 70 at this point, so she was probably born in about 1870, and so she's had a long life. But Jefferson is a place that is still a pretty rural kind of town. You got to remember that Homer, the man who comes to visit, not only is he a Northerner, but he's there to build roads. He's there to pave the streets in Jefferson, and that is relatively that's a big deal because even in the 30s, a lot of small towns still had dirt streets. In fact, where I live in Oakland between Webster Groves and Kirkwood, and I live on Sappington Road that goes from Manchester to Big Bend. Sappington was dirt until just before World War II. Now think about that for a minute. When you think of what Sappington looks like with, Ursuline Academy and all the other, subdivisions and things that exist on that road and how big it is in some places, it's almost unimaginable. But Sappington was dirt for most of its existence. It's relatively recently that it's been paved. Okay. So what's going on here? Well, the Griersons lose all their money because they do what other Confederates do. They buy Confederate money. Their money's in slaves and in land, and both of those things become less valued after the war, but especially the slaves, of course, because they're no longer assets, capital assets. Same thing happens, by the way, to the French in St. Louis. They were slaveholders, and during the Civil War, the French were also businessmen and merchants of a variety of kinds, but they also lost a tremendous amount of their capital after 1865 when the slaves were freed. Emily is a single woman. She's the only child of the Grierson family. Her father dies when she is relatively young. He has disapproved of every suitor she ever had. And so she's by herself. After he dies, at some point, the chronology is not clear. She meets Homer, and Homer is a Yankee. He's somebody from out of town who comes in with this road crew, and they are paving the streets for the first time because the town of Jefferson is suddenly turning into the 20th century. And they have a relationship, And as you find out in the story, something happens that causes her to poison him. Okay. And then she keeps the body of Homer in her house. And nobody finds any of this out until she dies. Okay. This is one of the scariest stories I have ever read. And as you read through it, I think you'll find sort of the same kind of astonishment that every reader does the first time you read the ending and you realize what she's been up to. But there's some other issues that are going on here as well. We could look at this as just a jilted woman exacts a particular kind of revenge, and that kind of revenge leads her to a particular form of madness. But there's some other things going on here as well. There's memory. There's Emily Grierson's memory. That is, what does she remember? What do people remember about her? What does the town remember about the time before Emily Grierson turned into what she became, this recluse? What does she mean? What does she signify to the newer people who are in town, the younger people? And then what do we know? This is something that the narrator in the story always talks about themselves. I'm not sure it's a man or a woman, as we. And so is he speaking for everybody in town? Is he speaking for him or herself? We don't know. But when you're reading a story, you got to kind of think about who's telling it and why is that person telling it the way it's being told. Are these things the narrator knows directly, or are these things the narrator is told by someone else? And so our whole notion of memory and how memory is constructed is really complicated. And this story is one of those that kinds of indicates just how complex memory is. Also, you get the sense in the story that time is not always linear. It doesn't move from, Tuesday to Wednesday to Thursday, from 1910 to 1912 to 1915, that it kind of goes back and forth. And you get that sense as little pieces of the story come out in different ways as we're told by the narrator what's going on. Okay. So the role of Emily is interesting. She's a type of person, somebody who's been displaced by the end of the Civil War in a particular way. She's also a woman who's been jilted by a man, and she exacts a particular kind of revenge. The townspeople, however, are always on the outside of this. They don't know what's going on in her house until after she's dead. And because of that, what the town people know or think they know is really kind of interesting. It's questionable in some ways because we're not really sure what exactly is on their mind. Okay. And how did they know or think they know what they know? So to me, this is a fascinating story. This is another one that I've read probably hundreds of times since the first time I read it when I was in college. And I hope that you'll find it as compelling as I have. The discussion board this week has 3 questions that raise some of these kinds of issues. They also raise one that the story doesn't spend much time on, but it's certainly something that we would probably notice now, and that is the issue of race. Most of the characters, almost without exception, are white in this story. And so most of the understanding of what we see going on in the town come from a white perspective. Well, of course, there are African Americans living here, the descendants of former slaves. And so what do they see? Where are their voices? How are they regarded? And you'll find, depending on how much time you spend with the story, the roles of those people are really kind of interesting. They are at the bottom of the hierarchy. In this period of time, of course, they can't vote. But the kinds of work that they do is not the same as what the white people are doing. And so when you finish the story, and if you do decide to write about this topic in the discussion board, I'll be fascinated to see what you think. So thank you very much. I took up way more of your time than I thought. I hope you enjoyed this week's work.